The goal of the council is to reseat experts that have been wrongly persecuted.
The reason I came here is to tell people the whole story.
I never imagined that what happened to me would happen. They targeted me to set an example.
We can't put the military complex and bioweapons and testing and big pharma in front of the American family anymore. I'm tired of it. I'm sick of it.
It also happens in medical school training, so it enforces compliance. You become part of the apparatchik.
I'm proud to sit at a table with two other physicians that get it.
I'm Nicole Shanahan, and welcome to the Council of the Cancelled, where free speech prevails. Today, we bring together a group of prominent experts who share one thing in common. Their work has been censored and their integrity questioned, all because their findings challenge the status quo. Together, we can shed new light on their perspectives and learn from their insights, no matter how inconvenient they may be to those who wish to silence their voices.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the second Council of the Cancelled. We're here in Dallas, Texas today with three of my favorite people in the whole wide world. And I just want to remind everyone why we're doing these. There are so many wrongly canceled experts across the United States and across the world right now. And these are qualified experts, predominantly in the medical field, that have been turned into heretics by our government because they are speaking truths. They are speaking certain truths that cause us to bring into question the public health narratives that are fed to us every single day in every channel you can imagine across our personal lives. We hear them at the dinner table. The media is feeding us these narratives, our school systems, our workplaces. It's penetrated every aspect of life. And there are very, very few doctors out there that are brave enough to look at their patient population and see that the narratives are wrong. And so we're here today with three of the best. And the goal of the council is to reseat experts that have been wrongly persecuted. And it's really important, I think, to hear these stories. These are not radical ideas. This is how science works. It's how it's always worked. It is designed to be empirical at first and then further investigated. And without that debate and investigation, we can't evolve as a society. And so here we are in the second council, and the goal is to think about medicine differently. And one way to do that is to decentralize it, to turn it into a decentralized, multinodal aggregation of experts that can come together, reach across different practices, and have an open debate and open forum on how to progress the field of science. So thank you so much, Dr. Wakefield, Dr. Kruse, and Dr. Bowden for joining me today. I'm going to start with introducing Dr. Wakefield. Andy, your name is one of the biggest names in autism, and it is the name that has been tied to don't you dare ever criticize vaccines for autism, because if you do, you will be disgraced for the remainder of your lifetime. That's the goal. That's the narrative. That's what I was told as a mother of a child diagnosed with autism, that if I dare look at the MMR vaccine, I will be treated as Andy Wakefield was treated. I will be denounced. I'll be criticized. I'll be told I'm crazy. I'll be labeled an anti-vaxxer and a dangerous person. It's been nearly 30 years since you published the Lancet article showing gut inflammation in a patient population that had come to you when you were working as a surgeon and a doctor in London. And sitting next to you, I have to say, I never thought I would be here today with you, because The stories are so forbidden, and giving them any credibility has not been allowed. But we live in a different world now. I believe it's time for you to be reseated.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I'd just love to hear from you. It's been almost 30 years. And before we went live, you said, we're winning. How are we winning?
Okay, well, I firstly, I was an entirely mainstream, whatever that means. I was a mainstream gastroenterologist, an academic working at the Royal Free Hospital in the University of London. I had a big research team looking at inflammatory bowel disease. And the first lesson that I learned in medicine was in the context of children, sick children, listen to the mother. Listen to the mother. Okay, not the man in the white coat. Listen to the mother, because instinctively she knows her child better than anyone else in the world. And I was presented with a clinical problem, which was children whose mothers, whose fathers reported that they had been perfectly fine. They could interact with their siblings. They had speech, language. And then around the age of 18 months, they were given an MMR vaccine, and then they regressed rapidly, dramatically, following a period of seizures, or the lights went out in their eyes, and they were ultimately diagnosed with autism. I said, I don't know anything about autism. You must have called the wrong number. I'm a gastroenterologist. Why are you calling me? Because, doctor, the physicians and nurses that I speak to about my child's gastrointestinal problems say, oh, that's just part of autism. Forget about it. Put your child in a home, get a new one, and move on. And that was the state of the nation at the time. But the story was extremely consistent, extremely plausible, and you have to listen. And so, of course, I pulled together a team of eminent researchers, highly published researchers, top pediatric gastroenterologists. We scoped these children, we biopsied them, we looked under the microscope, they had inflammation. The parents were right.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, we need to report this, which we did in an early series, as you mentioned, in the Lancet paper, reporting the first observation of inflammatory bowel disease in children with autism. Because the parents were right, the medical profession, almost to a man and a woman, were completely wrong on the subject of autism. There's no regression, children are born with it, diets don't help, all of these things fell by the wayside.
And the new narrative is we're just diagnosing it more.
Oh yes, we're just better at diagnosing it. The best diagnostician in the world was someone like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris at the end of the 19th century, even of the last century. They understood disease, they recognized disease, they could interpret physical signs in people. They couldn't treat many of the diseases, but they were outstanding clinicians. Had autism existed, they would have described it. Gilles de la Tourette would have described it. All of these people who worked under Charcot. And so when they said, my child regressed after a vaccine, we had to take that very, very seriously. And I did. I couldn't, you can't dissociate one from the other. You can't say you were absolutely right about this, but this is not going to be good for my career, so would you mind? There's the door, would you leave and take your child somewhere else? But that's what my colleagues, unfortunately, seem to advocate for. And the dean took me aside and said, if you continue this vaccine safety research, it will not be good for your career. Which, as an obstinate young gastroenterologist, that kind of made me redouble my efforts. But he was absolutely right. It wasn't good for my career. And I came to America and continued the work here. And I'm glad to say that now the bowel disease in autism, the gut-brain link, the role of gut bacteria is really emerging. But we are so far behind the curve because it got branded with this anti-vax narrative. And was that correct? Absolutely.
Well, and they ripped you of your credentials.
Yeah, they took everything, like my country, my credentials, my career, But you know what? That didn't matter. It really didn't matter, because what mattered was the next child with autism that I saw, that mattered. That child mattered, and that child didn't have a voice. And so I would look at this, and if I were feeling a little depressed, a little down in the dumps, I would say, you don't have a problem, so shut up and get on with it. This child has a problem. And that enabled me in many ways to get through it. And ultimately, because of the stand I'd taken on these issues, people would come to me from regulatory agencies like the CDC, the Department of Health in the UK, the FDA, or from the industry, from the vaccine manufacturers, and say, you know what, we have done a terrible thing. I can no longer live with this. Here is the evidence. And so I became a repository for whistleblowers. And initially I would hand those stories off to public interest lawyers, False Claims Act lawyers to be dealt with according to their merits. And then I thought, you know what, these would make amazing films. And I had a big interest in screenwriting and making movies, so I became a filmmaker.
I just saw Protocol 7, which is about the Merck MMR cover-up. And there's a scene in it that I had to stop the film after watching as a mother of an autistic child. It's a scene of that regression where the child's sitting under the fan. Many autistic children are enamored with fans, and that guttural, repetitive sound the child was making in the film that my child makes all the time, and the rocking back and forth. And I was devastated. And I had to turn it off, and I went and I sobbed for 3 hours. And this is what so many, it's this underground community of autism mothers. And we all whisper your research. We whisper it to each other because it's underground, because we can't say it or be heard saying it, because doing so would discredit us. It would make us seem like we've lost it, that we can't handle the emotion of the difficulty of the work of being a parent of a special needs child, because we're expected to be strong, to treat it, to accept it for what it is, to accept that it is unexplained and might not ever be explained and is incurable. So I just wanted to acknowledge that your name has been a name representing hope amongst many of us. And the diets and recommendations and the focus on gut health really are the first step many of us mothers do take, because it's one that we can take. We can try to help our children's guts heal.
Wonderful.
Mary, I want to go to you next, because Dr. Bowden, would you ever think that being an ENT, an eye, nose, and throat doctor, that you'd be sitting across from one of the most notorious doctors in all of history? Next to Galileo, possibly. There's Andy Wakefield.
No.
Never in a million years. You're the OG of medical cancellation, and it's an honor to be here. And I am so appreciative of you, Nicole, for giving us a voice, because very few politicians will.
Yeah, it's not about politics. I never went into this to do politics. I went into this because I was seeing something going very wrong. And I was lucky to find the people who gave me the courage to not doubt my intuition. But Mary, you are currently still in a legal battle with the Texas Medical Board, who has investigated you for treating your patients. And now you've treated over 6,000 patients for COVID-19 successfully. You've healed them. You've not lost one. And you are being investigated because you treated many of your patients with Ivermectin. And you were given a settlement agreement, but you had to admit to guilt, and you refused.
Right. Yeah. So the way this works, if you're accused of a misdeed by the Texas Medical Board, you go to a closed door meeting, and the medical board gives you their judgment, and you can take it or leave it. And they wanted me to pay $5,000, take 8 hours of CME, and then retake the jurisprudence exam, which is an exam all doctors have to get in Texas, which is like a medical legal exam. And I refused, and now they're dragging out the process. We're now at almost 3 years. It's been 18 pre-trial motions. They've added a second judge. It's been a circus. And basically, what I was doing was fighting for one particular patient, and I was also speaking out against mandates. And these complaints came from two big hospitals, did not come from patients. And it's amazing that it continues to drag on like this.
Yeah. And you've now had to fight this, but ivermectin has been vindicated as a treatment. Why is it that they're persecuting doctors for prescribing ivermectin? Is it merely because it is effective, or is there something about, and Dr. Kruse, I bet you have opinions on this too, but what is your, I mean, this must have been very surprising for you, because finding a course of treatment that works and using it time and time again, I mean, that's part of the practice of medicine.
Well, it was an orchestrated attack. I mean, it all started with the vaccine in March. The FDA put out a statement on their website, a page on their website, demonizing ivermectin. Shortly after that, Houston Methodist Hospital, where I had privileges, they declared they were mandating the shot for all their employees. They were the first major business or hospital to do so, and that was actually 4 months before Biden's mandate. So then at the same time, and they launched a PR campaign. So Biden spent $11.5 billion trying to encourage the public to get a shot. He partnered with something called the Public-Private Service Cooperation. They doled out money to 275 different organizations. It's such a tangled web that the money is basically untraceable. And then a few months later, because people were not getting the shots like they wanted them to, this was late August, then the FDA did their horse tweet, the infamous horse tweet. Mm-hmm. And that had dire consequences. 2 days after the horse tweet, the COVID shots got licensed. The EUA, they got full approval by the FDA. And then 2 weeks after that were the mandates. So it was all a very coordinated, well thought out plan. None of this was just events that just happened.
Mm-hmm. And if more people had gotten a chance to be treated with ivermectin, do you think we would have had the death rate that we did early on, especially amongst the elderly?
Absolutely not. I mean, I can't say that I didn't have any COVID patients die, but I can say that every single patient that got early treatment survived. Mm-hmm. And, one thing we were taught in medical school, there's been such a pushback against overprescribing antibiotics. Mm-hmm. And so we're trained to wait. Don't treat a cold, give it time, don't overprescribe. And that's sort of the mindset of most doctors. Well, that was a disaster during COVID. And, we had to learn some new tricks, and but the early treatment without fail, and, they could have stuck with monoclonal antibodies too. Those worked really well. Mm-hmm. But, when the vaccine mandates came out, the government took over distribution of monoclonal antibodies, and all of a sudden I couldn't get them for my patients. Mm-hmm. And that's why I switched to ivermectin. And I was actually worried because I didn't know if it was going to live up to the hype. I researched it deeply to make sure it was safe, first and foremost. And once I was assured that I wasn't going to hurt anybody, and then I started using it, and I found, oh gosh, it does work. It works really well. It works just as well as the monoclonal antibodies. So yeah, I think, a lot of people died unnecessarily because of what the government did.
Yeah. And it's still going on.
It's still a problem getting my patients ivermectin. Even though, we sued the FDA and won, and it's still a problem.
Yeah, that's okay. And I think all of us are asking the question, why? Why is this happening? Why is the government being so reckless in its disregard for patients that are reporting these issues that they're seeing after getting a vaccine, or issues that doctors are seeing in terms of what's most effective in treatment? And that brings me to you, Dr. Jack Kruse. You are a neurosurgeon. You just took a bullet out of someone's head just a few weeks ago. You've operated on thousands. You are I view you as a polymath in human biochemistry, and probably one of the most outspoken in the world of biochemistry and electrochemistry. And I would love to hear your take on what's going on.
Andy was canceled because he challenged the global world order of the industrial military complex. Big Pharma sits at the right hand, what we call the Cantillon Effect. The reason why they're important and the reason why they're given this spot is the Department of Defense was the distributor of this pharmaceutical. That's COVID. So let's get it straight. Big Pharma was the drug dealers for the government, okay? And here's the key point. The key point is the government, what they're doing to Mary. Andy's a global problem. She's a state and local problem. What you need to understand is the way this Cantillon effect works. When you understand the history pre-Andy, when you understand what happened with the Bidolac, when you understand what happened with the vaccine law, when you understand that Reagan put Fauci in, when you understand that the government was learning how to deal with big piles of money in collections, they began to realize that they can control the narrative. That began all the way back in the 40s and 50s with General Groves, when they didn't want the media in war, in theater, because they found it was bad for business. So what did they do in the 60s and 70s? Through several programs, that Bobby's talked about extensively, they realized that they could co-opt the media. So they've done it in different ways through different programs in the government. But what they do with science, what they did with science is they basically came up with a plan to use Big Pharma to allow them to pay media companies so that the media companies can be used as propaganda arms for mandates that the government want to go through. Now, the key in this whole process, your question, was why do they want to do that? That is probably the biggest nuclear question, because I think that goes to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter is that this fundamentally started out as a bioweapons program. And that started all the way back with the polio vaccine. And that's a story that begins in 1951.
So I think this is blowing everybody's mind. And I want to help people get there, because when people hear, well, maybe Andy was attacked for his Lancet study because they didn't want people questioning the safety of vaccines, because vaccines help more people than they hurt. And that is
But do a hard stop for a minute. I'm going to interrupt you on this. That's a ridiculous statement. Why? When you have complete immunity, you're a lawyer. What do they care what Andy says? If you have complete immunity.
It's true. The 1986 Vaccine
Correct.
Immunity Act means that someone like Andy should be allowed to speak. I mean, the commercial interests of the vaccine manufacturers is protected.
Why should they care?
That's a good point.
Right. And guess what? Now we get to the real point. The point is Andy slowed business down. Remember, incentives dictate outcomes. That's what it always comes down to. And it's the fiat money that's behind it, which is the point that I was trying to make to you about the Cantillon effect. Big Pharma sits there. But you have to understand how this started. Back when Andy was canceled in 98, it wasn't as bad as it is now, because who changed the mix? In the Obama administration, when Mary and I both started out in this business, Big Pharma couldn't advertise on TV. Obama changed all that in the States. I can't say anything about the UK, but that had a huge effect on our practice. Now, doctors, centralized doctors, they didn't realize what the effect was, but I can tell you the effect was dramatic, at least in my practice. I know that I saw it. And what I began to realize is that they were taking all this money, and I knew they were doing something with it, but I didn't know what. But since I'm an aficionado of history, especially when it comes to medical history, I realized that they could be doing the same thing that was uncovered in the Church Commission in 75 through 77. And what we found there, we found that some of the people that were involved in what happened here in Dallas with JFK and Bobby's dad, the Church Commission, that there was people that were weaponized that were working in the media for the FBI and the CIA, specifically Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather. Dan Rather's career was fueled by the JFK assassination. And a simple little senator from Kentucky brought this up in front of a Senate hearing committee, and everybody was shocked, kind of like when Mary went to her state board and church actually got them to admit that there was 400 people from the CIA working in the media at the behest of the executive branch of government. And people were stunned. So I thought to myself, could Big Pharma now be weaponizing advertising to actually subvert the First Amendment? Because that, once you begin to censor speech, then canceling people became, how shall you say, the only two people I knew that got canceled was Andy and Robert O. Becker. And the irony was both of them were tied to the same story you're laying out now. It was the industrial military complex behind it. And they had partners. Well, now the world that Mary and I live in, now censoring people and canceling, I mean, for simple stuff. I mean, to me, Ivermectin is a really simple thing.
Yeah, it seems so harmless and to be treated the way you did. And several others, I mean, thousands of doctors who have prescribed ivermectin have since been called into ethics investigations. So is this, COVID seemed to be something that really shattered a lot of the expectations of this system that you talk about. They figured, I think, that the majority of people would concede, which they did. They consented. They, almost 75% or 80% of the population got this experimental mRNA vaccine. I did. I was, in line for it as soon as it was available. And do you think that they're watching what's going on right now and thinking to themselves, oh, this isn't going exactly how we thought it was going to go?
I think they're very happy.
You think they're very happy? So it was achieved.
No, I think the goal was definitely achieved because now we know who was compliant, who wasn't, and they have a plan for the non-compliant as well. So you need, as a patient, a doctor, someone who's getting ready to vote on November 5th, you need to be educated. That's, to me, the reason I came here is to tell people the whole story. You need to know this in totality. You need to understand why the medical staff bylaws are weaponized on Mary's Sport. The hospitals are complicit in this. Why? They made more money. I can tell you. Now, the difference between Mary and I, neurosurgeons are the most profitable people in the hospital. Okay, we generally bring in $3 to $5 million per year to a hospital system. It can be more or less depending on the type of surgeries do. I had the hospitals that I was working with come in, take our ventilators away, tell me that all my elective cases had to be stopped. So as a surgical subspecialty, that effectively turned everything off overnight, okay? Any doctor that spoke up, the medical staff bylaws were then used to shut them up. And the key is when people got admitted, the way they were admitted, things that were put on the DRGs, everything was COVID. I remember several people I did residency with canceled me on Facebook when I told them that our hospital was making more money based on the DRG for the codes that were in there.
Yeah.
And I said, the hospitals are behind this. And you heard what Mary just said.
And
she didn't get turned
yeah.
in by patients. She got turned in by the damn hospital.
Yeah, I was going to add something about the outpatient procedures. So the theory with Methodists is that they were the first to mandate it so that they could proceed with their outpatient procedures, because that is the heart of a hospital. That's their financial cash cow, is outpatient procedures.
Wow.
And I do, as a neurosurgeon, like all my cervical fusions, like simple stuff is done, and those are highly profitable to a hospital.
Andy, I've got to ask you, you said before we started, you said when you made this discovery between autism, the gut, behavioral issues, that it was really you and maybe you could count on one hand how many other doctors were willing to look at this. And now today, almost 30 years later, we've got this going on with the COVID-19 vaccine, in which there are injuries and people are asking, is this injury due to the vaccine or is it due to the virus? When you saw all of this rolling out, this whole massive symphony of activity around this pandemic, was it clear to you what you were seeing, or were you always aware of it? Were you questioning the central narrative around the pandemic?
The truth is, at the time, I didn't want to go anywhere near it. I knew I wasn't going to have the vaccine. It was just so complex and so deceitful. But, I think it'll turn out to be the worst mistake they ever made. I really do, because when I got involved, like I said, there were 5 people around the world, a handful of people worldwide prepared to talk about the thorny subject of vaccine safety. Now it's more than half the adult population of the world.
Yeah.
Around every dinner table, the people are talking about this issue. They've made a huge mistake. And on the issues that were raised, the EUA was only possible for this vaccine, the emergency use authorization, if there was no other treatment available. So they had to suppress the use of Ivermectin in favor of a vaccine-only narrative. And this was being driven by people like Tony Fauci right up to the hilt. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the reason. The other thing that emerged was this, in the context of the MMR vaccine and autism, is that I went to the CDC back in 2000. And they said, look, Dr. Wakefield, everybody gets the MMR, only a few children have autism. So how do you equate that? Well, that's how medicine works. A lot of people smoked, but only a few developed lung cancer. But the point is, it's pattern of exposure. I said, look, we believe, for example, that age of exposure is important. And we know this because with the natural infection, the younger you get measles, the greater the risk of a more severe reaction. If you get it under 1, for example. Does the same pertain to the vaccine? If you get the vaccine younger, are you at greater risk? And they went away, to their credit, and they tested that hypothesis. And they found that it was exactly true. And they spent the next 14 years destroying the documents, putting them in a dumpster, and covering up and publishing a paper that exonerated the vaccine, until one of the whistleblowers, William Thompson, head scientist in that study, came forward and said, I can't live with this any longer. I kept the documents. Here they are. It showed fraud, most appalling violation of medical and scientific ethics on behalf of the CDC. So people say now, there's no evidence vaccines cause autism. Absolutely there is. Mm-hmm. And when you have to commit to that level of fraud, any level of fraud, but that level of fraud, not only in the context of this vaccine, but Pfizer in the context of the COVID vaccine, everybody else, you're on a losing run right from the start. You are going to lose, because you can only sustain that lie for so long. And then someone somewhere is going to come forward, some brave person, and say, actually, no, it was completely the opposite. And public confidence is shattered. It will never be regained. So now we are in a majority of people who are saying no to the 4th, 5th, 6th booster for COVID. And by definition, in media terms, those are anti-vaxxers. Yeah. More than half the adult population of the world are anti-vaxxers. So I think that, as I say, this will turn out to be the greatest mistake they ever made. And I think that we are winning. Uncomfortable as that may be, we are winning.
I'm really happy to hear that narrative, because I think to think of it within they've already won is really hard for a lot of people to swallow. I know it's hard for me to swallow that whatever the goal was of this last pandemic. Is.
Let's talk about that.
So let's talk about that. I mean, on one hand, we have more awareness. We can actually start to voice these conversations in live forums on X. I mean, that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. So we have that going for us. So I'm going to count that as a win. But there's something else going on that I think that Dr. Kruse, Jack, you have been saying people have to be aware of kind of a greater theme that is not just limited to what Mary is allowed to do with her patients, but is actually much bigger.
That's what's going on in the hospitals today. So I officially retired on August 6th. I can tell you what I've been doing the last 4 years now. I went back into the belly of the beast to see exactly what the effects would be. So one of the things that I think most people know is that COVID has a lot of neurologic side effects to it. One of the things that we started to notice within 6 months of the vaccine, at least in the United States, is that I was seeing a lot more blood clots, a lot more subdural hematomas, epidural hematomas. I was seeing some very, very unusual syndromes associated with neurologic problems, like people losing their vision right away. You know, they'll consult us to see if it was an aneurysm, a brain tumor. And then about 8-9 months, I started to see these very bizarre cases of people who had melanoma 20 years ago, and now they've got metastatic melanoma all over their body. Now they have GBMs. They're 32 years old. I started to see one of the ones that shocked me the most is a patient I was seeing in the ER, and there was another patient next to us, 13-year-old with complete heart block that had just gotten the vaccine and literally had to have a pacemaker put in. And when you start to see all these things, see the difference between, I think, Andy and myself, he's a gastroenterologist that came to this from his own patient base. In my residency, I knew and I was taught about the Cutter event. I was taught about what happened really with polio. I was taught about the first version of Andy Wakefield. Her name was Dr. Bernice Eddy. And she was taken out not only by Big Pharma, but it was the NIH. This would be the Tony Fauci of that day. And that person has now been whitewashed from history, meaning if you go back and look at the NIH FDA website from 1951 through 1957, you will not see anything about the Cutter incident. Most old doctors don't learn about it. Most young physicians have never even heard of it. They don't know anything about it. And when you learn about it and you understand that it was tied to a bioweapons program that began with a doctor named Alton Oshner in New Orleans, and you find out that Uncle Jack trained in New Orleans, and I knew a lot about why this was happening, I kept that story under my hat for a long time. Why? I told you guys this last night at dinner, that my mentor, the guy that I think really pushed me where I was going, is Robert O. Becker, who's an orthopedic surgeon who was canceled when he tried to alert the industrial military complex about non-native EMF through the sanguine antenna that was being built in Wisconsin to check Trident submarines. And he got so frustrated that he went on 60 Minutes and kind of pulled an Andy Wakefield. And unfortunately, in 2 weeks, the DOD pulled his funding. This gentleman was twice nominated for the Nobel Prize. So we're talking very, very powerful. And he made the mistake of going to the news media. And it turns out the people that he talked to were being paid by the CIA. And early in my career, because he was an orthopedic surgeon, my mentor in neurosurgery, Dr. David Klein, gave me the opportunity to do a talk on bone metabolism. And he goes, I want you to go study this guy Becker, because Dr. Klein was a big peripheral nerve researcher. And he said, this guy found some very interesting things in the early 60s, and his work has been buried. And you'll be shocked to know that he's actually from your home state, New York. So I went and I started to read his original papers, and I was stunned at what I found. The things that he found were absolutely mind-boggling. And I came back and did the residence report, and then I went the extra level. Dr. Becker died in 2008. I went to visit him before he died to talk to him. And part of the reason I did that is I found out that his compatriot in his lab was a guy named Dr. Andrew Marino. Turned out after they canceled him, Dr. Wakefield, he wound up relocating to LSU Shreveport. So he was in the same hospital system that Uncle Jack was a resident in. So I said, I think I need to go talk to this guy. And I wound up talking to Becker and Marino. And I will tell you, the difference between you and Dr. Becker is not a lot. The difference was, Becker told me, he goes, whatever you decide to do, if you decide to get involved in this game, you need to be aware of who you're up against. And that was the advice that I got then. And I have to tell you, when I explained some of the things that were going on in my residency and the things that I had found out about the JFK assassination and how the polio vaccine was tied to it, and how there was a secret bioweapons lab before Fort Detrick ever existed on Magazine Street between the U.S. Public Health Hospital, Charity Hospital, Ochsner Medical Foundation. He said, be wise with this information. Don't talk to too many people about it until you have everything completely fact-checked. And he said, be very careful about where the science leads you, because even when the science is true, as you found, the truth is not what these people are interested in. They are interested in one thing and one thing only: money and power. And because of that, I would say, and I can say this, at the end of my career, I'm in the most sued specialty in centralized medicine. I have not been sued, no suits against me at all for 30 years because of that advice that Dr. Becker gave me. I was very, very careful. You have my ultimate respect. Why? Because you did what Becker did. You went and you told the truth and you did it publicly and you didn't worry about it. Mary's going through it right now. Be careful. That's all I'm going to say. But give them no quarter. No quarter at all. My job now is that of Paul Revere or Thomas Jefferson. I've decided to take the battle to another country, to a place where the president of a country has decided to listen to crazy Uncle Jack. Why? Because when he started seeing patients that his health ministry allowed to have the jab like Mary did, unlike the politicians in Texas, unlike the politicians that we have in the United States, he said, who's this crazy son of a bitch on Twitter that keeps saying all these things when everybody else is getting canceled? He goes, go bring him in, because we have all these jab injuries too. Mm-hmm. And that's where I sat down with him and I told him about Benjamin Rush. And I told him about why the industrial military complex decided to use medical tyranny and vaccines as the target vector for the U.S. Constitution. Why? Thomas Jefferson had a discussion with James Madison, two Brits, just so you know, you're in this game, Andy. And Benjamin Rush tried to get medical tyranny into the U.S. Constitution. The two gentlemen that were writing this through the Federalist Papers couldn't find one attack vector in 5,000 years of human history where this has been used before, so they said no. So I can tell you where this process started. The original bioweapons lab, actually in the United States, was by mistake. It was a mistake that happened with Jonas Salk. That's the reason he never won a Nobel Prize. And it's a mistake that they try to fix with the use of radiation on the polio vaccine. And instead of being able to fix it, they actually made it worse. And when they decided that it was not a fixable event, then they decided to use it. They decided, well, there's got to be some use for that. And that's where the industrial military complex began to realize that science was a good gig. And General Kruse knew the story as a lieutenant general about Benjamin Rush. And that's when he decided to attack the U.S. Constitution and set up a shadow government. And that's why he was forced out of government by Dwight D. Eisenhower very, very early. Why? Because Eisenhower didn't like General Kruse at all. He thought that the generals that were in the theater, that were fighting the Nazis, that were fighting the Japanese, were the people we should listen to. He thought that a civil engineer, which is what Kruse was, and he worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, he basically had a bunch of scientists that he was managing to do this Manhattan Project. He didn't think he was the guy that should be turned over in post-World War II to rebuild Europe, rebuild, Russia, and also rebuild the United States. So they didn't like each other. And it turned out Eisenhower kind of won, but here's the parting gift out the door. General Kruse installed a vice presidential candidate named Harry Truman. He got rid of the 3-term guy. His name's Henry Wallace. Why? Because he was worried that the polio that FDR had would take him out in the fourth term. And he was right. He got taken out early in the fourth term in April of 45. He installed his first Manchurian candidate. What was the goal? The goal was to set up the industrial military complex. The first thing that he got Truman to do was to change the office of the OSS to the CIA. And that was done in an executive order in 1947. With that, Eisenhower had a clue what was going on, and Eisenhower actually got Kruse out. What did Kruse do? He went and started to work for military contractors outside the system. And guess what he found? It's a very good place to be. He didn't have a place in post-World War II military because he was not like the guys that won the war. We didn't need to drop the bomb. He said, if I'm going to get all these scientists from Operation Paperclip that we stole from the Nazis, even the people that came over with Ernest von Braun, NASA was built because we had Nazi scientists. This totally changed the game. And that's when General Kruse realized that science and the industrial military complex is a good gig. And then the polio thing happens in 1951. And then guess what happens? Eisenhower is the president. Eisenhower realized how bad this was. Who was his vice president at the time? Nixon. And Nixon was in charge as the VP to manage the mess at the FDA, to manage the mess at the NIH, the first mess. They canceled everybody, and then they hired a guy named Alton Ochsner, who happens to be the guy on the name of the building that I did my residency at. And they decided to come up with a solution. At that time, Ochsner was looked at as the anti-cancer doctor because he famously used to bring the medical students in and say, you'll never see this kind of case of cancer in your whole career. So when they grew the polio virus, back then, remember, it's 1951. You know that Watson and Crick came up with DNA in 53. They found when they gave it to the pharmaceutical company, Ochsner gave it to Cutter. Cutter was a pharmaceutical company in California where Kruse and all his flunkies were, and they could only grow it on African green monkeys. So what did they do? They grew the virus on there, and when they did that, they gave it back to Bernice Eddy to test on animals and humans. And what did she find? That people were still getting polio. How crazy was this? You're going to love this part. So Ochsner owns a lot of stock in Cutter Pharmaceuticals because he's conflicted, or how shall you say, Cantillon Effect. And he injects his grandson and his granddaughter in the amphitheater of Charity Hospital in New Orleans. His grandson dies of polio in 7 days, and his granddaughter gets polio in her leg. She survives. So, of course, you can imagine in front of the medical staff, there's a huge problem. So Ochsner then goes out and looks for people in the medical community that could help with this problem. He knows what the issue is because Bernice Eddy gets up at a New York Academy of Science meeting in 1951, and at the end of her talk casually drops that nuclear weapon, that SV40 was found in the polio vaccine. And my bosses at the NIH knew it, the bosses in the hospital knew it, and the Department of Defense still sent 300 million doses out to the world. They didn't care then. So why would they care now?
Wow. I mean, that's a lot, I think, for people to take in.
Well, I think let's finish it off for the people in the audience, just so we're clear now. So if you don't think this makes a big deal for COVID, Mary and I are on Twitter a lot. I haven't seen Andy on there, but I've been following a guy named Kevin McKiernan for a long time. Kevin worked on the Human Genome Project. He's a big-time researcher. He worked with Craig Ventnor. People started sending Kevin empty vials of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. He started testing it because people were kind of concerned about it. Guess what he found? He found SV40 and DNA plasmids in the COVID jab that go all the way back to the polio virus. So, given all the things you know, don't you find it a little bit funny that spanning 50 years, that we have an SV40 promoter that we know exactly what it does, gets through the nuclear membrane, and we have new gene technology. And we have Pfizer has a patent that has 2 legal definitions, one for Pfizer, one for BioNTech. Might they decide to show the FDA one patent or one vaccine, but hold the other one back that you didn't have to worry about? So, of course, everybody thought Kevin was crazy. Many of your detractors are now on their second generation, and one of those guys' name was Philip Buchholz. He's a virologist at the University of South Carolina. He got so sick of listening to Kevin on Twitter that he said, I'm going to shut this asshole up. And he does the same test, Dr. Wakefield. And guess what he finds?
Same thing.
You got it. Mm-hmm. And he goes to the Senate of South Carolina as a centralized doctor and tells the government the truth. Are we still mandating the shots in the United States, guys?
There's still mandates. There's still mandates, and we've got to help people out right now. We opened up the line for questions, and we've gotten hundreds of questions. People are out there in this country right now. A lot of people are hurting. A lot of people just don't feel well, and they want to know how to get better. I think everyone's eager to move on from this. Obviously, anyone in government, a politician, there is a call for people to enter politics right now to address these issues, the undermining of human health and decency, for these other purposes that we can't be doing that anymore. We can't. We can't put the military complex and bioweapons and testing and big pharma in front of the American family anymore. I'm tired of it. I'm sick of it. And we've got to move on, and people need to heal. So I think people watching this are going to look into some of the things you said, Dr. Kruse, and I think it takes the air out of you to think that this is a multi-generation effort.
It's 75 years.
It's 75 years in the running.
And just remember, Pfizer did ask for 75 years, just like JFK's archive is 75 years. Don't you find that a little interesting?
I do. Well, let's try to help people, because I know all 3 of you guys have dedicated your lives to helping people heal and overcome these injuries and overcome the damages that this system has caused. So I'm going to present the first question. Anyone jump in there and feel free to answer. Ryan asks, what would be your, and just a quick disclaimer, we're not giving anyone medical advice for you to go out and do, but this is empirical practice, evidence-based findings from these individuals that are happy to share, but please do seek out direct qualified medical help. I just had to put that disclaimer out there. So Ryan asks, what would be your top 3 treatments for autism ASD?
Very good question. Let me just say that I'm no longer in clinical practice and things have moved along. So there are better experts to answer that question in terms of they've been doing the subsequent trial. The things that really worked for us back in 20, 25 years ago were get the gut, heal the gut. And people, believe it or not, the gut is connected to the brain, whether it's through the microbiome or the immune system in the gut, whatever it might be. But one of the most important things that we saw was the response to diet. Mm-hmm. And what we did is parents said, we took milk out, milk as a source of beta-casein or casomorphine or whatever it might be. We never got to learn the mechanism, but take dairy products out. And what you see almost immediately in many, many of these children who undergo regressive autism, normality regressing into autism with bowel problems, is sleep patterns change. The child starts sleeping at night. If that happens, then you know that diet is very likely to be effective, and therefore institute a gluten-free diet as well. And now that is very, very much more simple now than it was back when we started. Then you used to have to throw everything out of the kitchen, start again.
And there's a difference between pasteurized and unpasteurized milk as well. That I've chatted with some doctors about.
Right, but they still are a source of beta casein, and that may be one of the whether it promotes an immune response, an allergic type immune response, whether it acts as a neurotoxin, or both, or neither of those, some other mechanism. So you'll notice if that happens, then you'll see an incremental increase, very likely with the removal of gluten-based products, particularly with the gluten that we use in this country at the moment, because it seems to be a genetically modified gluten that's particularly difficult to
There's
digest.
glyphosate.
That's right. And then beyond that, the sort of things that really helped were the introduction of probiotics. I'm not going to name any particular brands, but the introduction of probiotics and supplementation to help heal the gut.
Yeah.
And if those things work, then, there are many more things that can be done to heal the gut, like pharmaceuticals we would use for Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. They needn't be the first line of treatment, but they may add an incremental improvement to the child.
Yeah.
some
Or
kind
even
of
eating
anti-
some sauerkraut.
Even
Kimchi,
eating some sauerkraut, a
fermented
great source
foods.
of
That's what
probiotics.
I do in my
absolutely.
household.
So that's where I would start. And then beyond that, and do your research. Get online. There's an abundance of research, some of it good, some of it bad. But some of, you need to become your own advocate. You're advocate for your own child, and that's fine.
So, Nicole, our history. I wrote a blog for Echo. My approach is what I would say 30 years after Andy. I start with light, water, and magnetism. Those are the fundamentals of how mitochondria work. The brain-gut connection is both real and unreal, meaning that it's the vagus nerve, it's the microbiome, but the microbiome operates by biophoton release. And what makes the biophotons is actually the mitochondria. So autism functionally is a mitochondrial disease impacted by many other things. So I would tell people, as Andy said, do your homework. If you want to read Echo's blog, it's called the Quantum Engineering 45 blog. It's a very, very basic blog that tells you where the problem began in the brain, how it's impacted by light, non-native EMF, things like of that sort, and leads to many of the conditions that, kids with autism that are on the spectrum get.
Okay. Quantum
Engineering 45
Engineering 45
on Patreon.
on Patreon, your website.
Correct.
Okay, great. Next question. My son started having grand mal seizures the same day as one of his childhood vaccines, DPT. He was 6 months old and they persist to this day. He's now 32 years old. What did that shot do to him?
Well, there's no way for us to know, but I can tell you as a brain surgeon, we know that likely the problem's in the gray matter at the neocortical level. EEGs would probably, done by the neurologist, would able to localize the seizure. The big question then is what to do about it. Fundamentally, at a mitochondrial level, when Andy was treating people, you didn't have the armamentarium that we have now. So one of the things you could use, we now know that infrared A and near infrared light penetrates the skull, the scalp, gets directly to the neocortex. The neocortex, where the mitochondria is actually on the surface of the brain. So you can easily get there by red light. And for the moms in the audience who don't know, Nicole graciously spent a lot of money to do some work with Francisco Gonzalez Lima at the University of Texas at my behest to study red light and autism, because it's the first step in improving mitochondrial function. But there's other things this person can do. And you need to understand how mitochondrial medicine can help with this issue. And like I said, I can't go too much into, treating someone there. But one of the things that I can tell you that I use with some of my NFL patients who have concussions, who develop seizure disorders like this, when Andy was in practice, we didn't have this. We now have what we call transcranial magnets. They look like circles like that. And we can put it right over the affected area once the neurologist tells us where the lesion is. Mm-hmm. And we can direct magnetic flux to actually improve the spin rate of the ATPase. It's not for prime time, but here's the cool thing. You can actually buy these yourself now on the internet, and then you can go take a class with the manufacturer, learn how to use it yourself. Or you can hire me or my nurse and we can show you how to use these things. The most common application for me is in professional athletes, hockey players, football players who are worried about neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontal temporal dysplasia. Most of these patients also have a period of time where they develop seizures. So seizures are very common manifestation of a mitochondrial injury in the brain.
Interesting. And so you have patients that are currently professional athletes.
Oh, many.
So top performers. So you got
yes.
to bring them back fast.
Well, I think I look at it like this. I'm sure you feel Echo's a top performer too. We just got to give her a tune-up, right? That's all.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. I look at it that...
And this is no surgery, no gene therapy.
Well, I call it brain surgery without a scalpel. See, I do brain surgery with a scalpel. But I think the most interesting things that I've learned through this whole process is how to use the natural forces in nature, the decentralized things, light and dark cycle, water and melanin, how you optimize mitochondrial function. There's a lot of different things we use. Like you heard Mary talk about Ivermectin. She wants it in her bag. I went more proximal. I went and used methylene blue and hydrochloroquine. Why? Tony Fauci came out with a paper in 2005, Andy, that basically said that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine works really good. His name's on the paper, but he denied that it was ever out there. The media helped bury it for him because it would have blocked the EAU. So I casually told all my members behind the scene, my patients behind the scene, do you know where hydroxychloroquine comes from? It comes from methylene blue. And you can buy that over the counter and you don't need the pharmacist. You can say that to them. And guess what? It also works for COVID. Now, you have to be taught how to do it. It's not something I'm going to talk about on an X basis. But did I talk to people about that then? Because Andy correctly pointed out, the EAU was what they had to dance around.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good to hear. I've been seeing all of these pretty invasive treatments for autism that I think it's too much for a small child to go through. So if there are non-invasive, gentle treatments that can help them heal.
We have to be careful about the snake oil salesmen. They've been present in medicine 5,000 years forward. And, a lot of people felt, that what Andy was doing 30 years ago was bullshit. A lot of people think what I do right now is bullshit.
Well, now
we already know the
common
Texas
knowledge.
Medical Board thinks what she's doing is bullshit. But the bottom line is, in decentralized medicine versus centralized medicine, she has the Texas Medical Board, she has the hospitals as her oracle problem. There should be nobody. The thing I love about what Mary says on Twitter, there should be nobody between the doctor and the patient. We should be able to listen to our patients and deliver care.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about, we have a 30-year-old who says, I've been consuming microplastics, seed oils, and highly processed foods my entire life. Is there evidence or hope of eating clean for a certain amount of time and clearing most, if not all, from our systems?
I believe there is.
The body has an extraordinary ability to heal itself. It's a remarkable piece of biomachinery. And I think that there is every reason to believe that if you take the pressure off by removing the sources of toxins and combine that with ways in which you can enhance their removal from the body, then there's every opportunity for improvement. It used to be, my father was a neurologist, and he would say to me, once the brain's damaged, you can't heal it. You can't heal it. Now that's been thrown out the window. It was the state of knowledge at the time. It's not true anymore. The brain is plastic. It can heal itself if you give it the right impetus to do so and take the toxic pressures of it that might be compromising its ability to do that. So, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I've heard incredible stories of women who were told they were infertile and changed diet, lifestyle, rid of all endocrine disrupting chemicals, got outside in the sun more, swam in the ocean, and then became hyper fertile. Did some acupuncture as well, which seems to help.
Oh, the thing I would say about this, because you heard me mention the name before, Robert O. Becker, his research was on limb regeneration, but what he was all about was regeneration of tissues. And that's really what we're talking about here. Healing is about regeneration. The key in his research, if you distilled it all the way down after you read it all, we have a DC electric current in our body. Mm-hmm. The higher DC electric current is, the better you do. What is the key metric in the body that builds the highest DC electric current? It means whatever makes more electrons. Turns out melanin from a gene in us called POMC does that. That's actually the source of the blog that I wrote for your daughter, but it's also the thing that we need to start with. But as you know, both of you know, Bill Gates, dermatologists and ophthalmologists all want to block the sun. And the only way you turn POMC on is with UV light. We've demonized the major healer for regeneration in just about every disease. So it should be no mystery why we talk about snake oil salesmen and we have to be worried about them.
Mm-hmm. Next question is for Dr. Bowden. Dr. Bowden, can you talk about the importance of free speech for doctors and the impact censorship is having on the medical community?
I never imagined that what happened to me would happen. I was on Twitter and I had maybe a few thousand followers. I was pretty conservative about what I said. I said things like Ivermectin works and vaccine mandates are wrong. I was not as open as I am now by far. And they targeted me to set an example, and it worked. I mean, I hear from so many doctors that I'm scared to speak up. And I was expendable. I was, if I'd been the chief of cardiothoracic surgery or maybe the chief of neurosurgery at Methodist Hospital, I can guarantee you they would have pulled me aside and had a private conversation and maybe threatened me, but they wouldn't have publicly targeted me like they did. That being said, I have zero regrets. It has emboldened me. Once I got over the initial shock, it was game on, and I would encourage every doctor out there to speak up because, it was painful at first, but it's changed my life. But I sleep well at night, and I wouldn't have done it any other way.
Yeah. Well, and if you didn't speak the way you did, it would have such a chilling effect on everybody else. I think hearing you speak, hearing you succeed, but also hearing you talk about these very real and scary challenges as they come up, like, these bubbling legal fees that you have to now pay. I was really heartened to hear that your attorney is now taking your case pro bono. That's wonderful. I've thought also about what it would look like to create a fund to help defend free speech for doctors that are trying to whistleblow. I think that would be really helpful. I can't think of how many licenses are under threat right now across the country, and they shouldn't be, and they should be defended.
Well, and I will say, doctors are a certain breed. Most doctors, to get into medical school, you have to make straight A's. You have to be a rule follower. You have to fall in line. If you go outside the lane, you get smacked back. I've never been in the military, but I imagine it's very similar. And it attracts a certain personality. So I think that's also part of the problem, that even if they were assured, okay, well, we'll fight for you, we'll pay for your legal defenses, I just don't think there are that many doctors that are willing to put themselves out there, even if they have some assured protection.
I think that's the point that she just brought up. I think all of us at the table know this, but I don't think the audience does. Mary brings up probably the biggest change I've seen in my medical career. When I started residency in 88, 89, 95 to 98% of neurosurgeons were in private practice by themselves. Today, it's like 65 to 80% are now employed physicians. So the point that she just made, when you're a doctor and you're employed, the doctor is incentivized by the person who's paying the bills. When you're a doctor, is by themselves, meaning fully decentralized, and there's nobody in between them, your doctor is working for you. So I do believe the compliance issue that she just brought up, the falling in line, is much easier. And do I believe also that that trend began in 1986 at the Harvard School of Medicine and also at Stanford University, because they're the ones that were behind the DRGs for centralized medicine. That's what HMO medicine started as, but we don't have those conversations anymore in medicine because they've already won.
It also happens in medical school training. And you mentioned that. And what happens is they have a multiple choice test for the medical students, and they have to pass that test to get to the next level. And the test asks, whether vaccine science is adequate and vaccines are safe and effective, and do you believe the conspiracy? And if you do not give the right answer that says Wakefield's a complete lunatic and he's surrounded by these other lunatics, if you don't give the right answer, you will not pass. You will not become a doctor. So it enforces compliance. You become part of the apparatchik. You become part of the system because you gave the answers to the system that it demanded of you to go to the next level. So it becomes a selection process for doctors who are prepared to fall in line and do what they're told.
And the medical staff bylaws at every hospital, you guys know, that's after residency, that's when you're put in jail again. In other words, these are the things that you can do. The state medical boards, Mary has, her state medical board is different than my state medical board. Doctors need to be aware of how the differences allow different movements. And most doctors, when they come out of residency, they don't know any of these things, but they find out about them as soon as they step out of line, because that's what they're threatened with. The CEO, the COO of hospitals, I have been threatened by them. And I was the wrong guy to threaten because I wasn't like all the other doctors. Nobody was going to tell me what to do. That's the way I'm built. But to her point, this is the thing that I worry about, the future of centralized medicine.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem for medical students. It's a huge problem for PAs, nurses. Nurses have it even worse than we have it because they are total bean counters for the system.
Yeah. It's hard for me to think of how to overcome the licensing requirements, which are embedded with these requirements that make it so that you can't think in any productive way beyond what they're telling you, and that it's
just
that
think
it's
about like
black
a
and
casino.
white, even if it isn't completely well understood science.
It's a casino. The house always wins. That's how the system is set up. It's all about money. Once you get to that point, you need to understand how science was co-opted. Once you understand that, realize that I know a lot of patients out there want to pound their doctors. They're upset. They're
Patients
pissed
are
off.
really frustrated right now.
They are.
They're
pissed
sick
off
and
they
they're
should
frustrated.
be.
Yeah.
But guess what? They have to help us help them. You hear what Mary's going through now. You already know what Andy went through. I'm telling you, you need to be proactive. Now, the reason I'm optimistic is different than Andy.
I think that there are certain things that need to happen in this vein, and that is needs to happen from the top down. The only person, and I'm not saying this because you're here or we're supported, the only person who can make this happen is Bobby Kennedy. He's the only person who understands it. He's the only person who has the courage to stand up against. And if he has a position that oversees the regulatory agencies, that can dissociate this poisonous relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the agencies. And it can start from the bottom upwards by the people being educated about this. And that is happening. And I found that film is a major part of educating people in that direction.
And I think you just made a really good point. I wasn't going to bring it up, but I'm really happy you did. And one of the reasons why we did this partnership with Donald Trump is that Donald Trump aligned himself with this mission. And, there's no promise. You can't promise any of these things, but what you can do is see people's reactions and gauge them and gauge their sincerity. And I will say, because many of the medical freedom community are not thrilled about voting for Donald Trump this come November. I know you're not thrilled about it. You've been very vocal. And I've heard from thousands of others who aren't thrilled about voting for Donald Trump. But the reality is that it is our best shot. It is the shot we've got right now. It's on the table. So come November, please do vote with that in mind.
Absolutely, no
Please
question.
do.
Hey,
Yep.
right
And make
here.
America healthy again.
That's it.
Woo.
Take a look at it.
All right, we have time. We have 15 more minutes. So I think we can take a few more of these questions. What are your thoughts on the long-term impacts of contaminants like pharmaceutical residues and PFAS, forever chemicals, being introduced into our food chain, crops and livestock, and water supply? And then there's a mention of waste disposal companies who make millions disposing of sewage, only to turn around and rebrand it as free fertilizers for small farmers. I mean, that's wild.
Well, I mean, that's a great business opportunity, that's there. I think there's two answers there. One is what Bobby's been talking about his whole career, is getting rid of that stuff. But the second issue is patients need to understand that even when you get forever chemicals, they're answers. I gave it to you earlier about learning about how we regenerate. Melanin is the key. Most people don't know that melanin in our surfaces and endogenously inside us. I'll tell you a quick story so that people get this correctly. Melanin binds all heavy metals. It binds microplastics. It gets rid of it. How does this work in birds? In London and even in Texas, this all pigeons always look dark and black. They live in cities. They take in all the diesel fumes. They get rid of all of that in their feathers when they molt. We do the same thing. Are there papers out there that show that melanin has this ability? Turns out we do. So we have to teach people about the leptin melanocortin pathway. It's hard to do when we have the FDA approving things like Ozempic that act on that pathway to ruin it.
Yeah, I think so. There is optimism to get these chemicals out of our body.
I think we can do it.
That's fantastic. I mean, that's wonderful to hear.
We're planning on testing it in El Salvador. That I can tell you. I've got a plan for that.
Okay, well, we've got to follow that. That's really exciting. Dr. Wakefield, I'm constantly told by my ex-husband to stop looking into fake science. How do I practice non-compliance as a citizen concerned about health in a coercive industry and living under a corrupt government?
One of the reasons I went into making film is that in the clinic I could help one child at a time. Making a film, you can help 100,000 children at one time by educating the public, not pushing a message, but just telling the truth. Acting and filming, producing with integrity. And those films address exactly these issues. What to do, how to do it, what the science really says. For example, with the Thompson fraud in Vaxxed, we accuse those scientists of some of the worst crimes against humanity ever. Why? Because they were sworn to protect the health of American children. They did completely the opposite. Okay, now if there'd been one word of a lie, one falsehood, they would have sued us to the moon and back again. There was silence, absolute silence. Why? Because they knew it was true. So you can trust a film that takes on that issue and delivers that to give you the facts. That's all we're interested in doing. So I have found from a personal perspective, and I'll continue to do it, is that filmmaking is one way, at least the way I can contribute to helping people, educate them, and allowing them, therefore, to stand up to their physicians, their friends, their husbands and wives, in a way that is meaningful, that confronts the other party with the scientific facts and say, go ahead, challenge them.
I just love what he said.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's
I'm
really
proud
excellent.
to sit at a table with two other physicians that get it.
Likewise, thank you.
This one came in from Jordan Lar. Nicole and Dr. Bowden, I am a former Air Force intel officer who was discharged from the military after being denied a medical and religious exemption for the COVID shot because I wanted to protect my fertility. I have a fertility disorder and at the time had been seeing a fertility specialist, which the Department of Defense knew about because they referred me. And I'm vaccine injured from Gardasil. I didn't want to further compromise my fertility by taking the COVID-19 vaccine. There's so many female members like me, males as well, who were forced out of the military for wanting to protect their fertility. Will you work with the next administration to study fertility rates and complications of military members compared to the general population? My husband got the shot to save his career, and he is injured because of it. Wow.
That's interesting. I actually tried to do a study on testosterone levels before and after the booster shot. I was working with a like-minded urologist, and we raised the money to do the study. We tried to submit it to the IRB, and the IRB would not even consider looking at the study.
Which IRB was it?
It was Western IRB. And they have all over their website about COVID. We're the leading COVID research IRB. They would not even take our money to consider our study. It was a very simple, just take a blood test before the booster and take a couple of blood tests after the booster. There was no intervention. So yeah, I mean, obviously that's an area that I would be interested in. But as a solo physician, I'm pretty limited in what kind of research I can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the largest donor into women's reproductive longevity and trying to fill in the missing generations of research into ovarian function. It's the most ignored organ in the entire body. If you compare it to the literature on lungs and stomach and brains and hearts, I mean, ovaries have been left behind in the dust in terms of who's funding it, how they're researching it. They're looking at it from a functional and foundational science perspective. It's been really interesting to go into the field, inject $100 million, and to see people are like, oh my God, we've never seen funding for this before. And so how do we even understand the impact of these very complex vaccines that are now gene treatment vaccines on ovarian function when we don't even have the basic science on ovarian function done?
I think the answer, and I think you know this, is we need to build decentralized research centers. If you want to fix medicine, you have to realize what feeds it. What feeds it's the science and the pharmaceuticals. You have to cut the pharmaceuticals out of the research, and we have to build places. I told you my plan was to do one in El Salvador because the climate there politically is very open to what Mary just said. And I want everybody out there who's this is the kind of story that bothers me. What controls fecundity in humans? The leptin melanocortin pathway. Isn't it kind of funny we keep coming back to that? There's a test that women never get told about when they go through menopause or perimenopause. It's called inhibin. Most doctors have never heard about it. You do an inhibin test. That would be an easy way to test that. Are these protocols that I plan to bring to El Salvador? So if you can't get it because the wrong person wins on the 5th, then come down and do a medical trip, and we'll hook you up with somebody who can know that. And hopefully Nicole and I can do something about this very issue, because I can't tell you how many of those ladies and guys contacted me in those 4 years of COVID because they knew I knew a lot about how hormones really work, with this pathway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Our military members that weren't able to get the exemptions. I mean, if anyone should have qualified for the exemptions, it would be those service members that are protecting this country and risking their lives to protect this country. But we owe it to them to protect their basic human rights, which is fertility is a basic human right.
Well, guess what? Doctors didn't get it either. But the funny thing is, last time I checked, the politicians certainly seemed to get an exemption, like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, whose country was paid off. We just found out that they didn't have to take the jab when everybody else did. So I look at it like this. When politicians exempt themselves, doctors, nurses, military people, that should tell you that something nefarious is really going on.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Oh gosh, there's carnivore diet on here. I'm going to let you guys choose. Because Dr. Bowden, I know you've tried the carnivore diet. Maybe we take that one, because the other one on here is government, media, censorship. How do we kind of protect ourselves from it? So let's take those two. Dr. Bowden, I've been on the carnivore diet for the last 40 days and have never felt better. Let's make grass-fed cows and pasture-raised eggs a priority. I think if more people ate such a diet, we would have less sickness. How is that carnivore diet going for you?
I'm day 45. It's still a little rough.
Yeah.
I won't lie. It's easier. I haven't reached that, oh my gosh, I feel so much better moment. But I'm not miserable. So, and I've lost weight, and it was pretty easy to lose the weight. I'll say that. I haven't been hungry. It's fatigue and then not having the choices that you normally have. I think the best diet is the diet that works for you. I'm not going to say the carnivore diet is the only diet and you've got to do carnivore diet. But I do think like a simplified diet where you're cooking at home and you're not drinking alcohol. I mean, there's a lot to be said. That's pretty basic. And then, the jury's still out for me on that.
Yeah. I will just share my diet. I think starting with fermented foods in the morning has been very helpful for me. I do like pasture-raised eggs and some sauerkraut and sunshine and a little bit of coffee. Sourdough is an interesting one if you like really are craving grains because it's partially fermented, so easier to digest. But there's all of this great literature out there today, and there's different ways to look at it. But certainly just assuming a plant-based diet is the right thing for you. If you're not feeling good on a plant-based diet, definitely try adding meat back in. I think that balance is oftentimes really good for a lot of people, but everyone's different and everyone's microbiome is a little different. So making sure people are able to feel empowered to try one out or another. Okay, last question. I went through most of COVID and believed the vaccine narrative coming from the government and media. I did too. I'm speaking for myself. What can we do in the future to fix the censorship problem? We need the best science to win no matter where it takes us.
I think one point that you raised is very important. Firstly, you have to dissociate direct-to-consumer advertising, so they don't have the influence on the media that they have at the moment. If you can, nightly news networks in this country and New Zealand really are the main source of income. Their main source of income is the pharmaceutical industry. That's a very, very dangerous situation because then your standard of living is dependent upon your sponsors. I did an interview with Cheryl Axon once when she was still at CBS, outstanding journalist. And she said, Andy, in 15 minutes after we cut this and the guys upstairs see it, we'll get a call from our sponsors saying, you're going to kill this piece. The sponsors being the pharmaceutical industry. She was wrong. It was 5 minutes. 5 minutes. And that's what happens. That is censorship, okay?
Yeah.
We were talking about just the most basic issues of safety, vaccine safety. Nothing, but it had to go. It could not exist. It could not be in the public realm because it was offensive to the people who pay for the media. So I think we've got to dissociate the media and their priorities from the pharmaceutical industry's bottom line.
Yeah, making pharmaceutical advertising illegal. It was very common thing to consider.
Prior to Obama. It's very, very recent in the United States.
Yeah, interesting. What do you guys, any comments on that? I think this is a really big one to close on.
75% of television ads are from pharmaceutical companies, and they spent $450 million last year. And in terms of Cheryl Atkinson, I'm reading her book right now, Follow the Science. Highly recommend. You are featured heavily in it. It's an excellent book.
Okay, we'll have to, yes, you just gifted Jacob and I a copy. Thank you. We'll be reading that.
I said my piece. I think the problem with Big Pharma is we need to remove them from the Cantillon Effect. The fact that they're closest to the money printer, the United States federal government pays them more money than anybody else, and they're in cahoots together, and that cahoots needs to be broken up. Mm-hmm. You see it, and the lawfare that they're using against the public by using those dollars is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And you cannot, as a doctor, look, we can diagnose the problem, But if we don't have the ability to do what we have to for our patients, what good is the issue? It's like ideation without execution leads to deletion of every good idea. So we've got to make the accurate diagnosis and do the right thing.
Amen to that. We have 1 minute left. I just wanted to use that to thank the three of you for joining me today. I know that we all are hoping for something better for our children. I refuse to let my children grow up under these conditions. I just won't let it happen. And, it's going to take us working together, keeping our head held high as long as it takes, taking the wins as they come, and allowing us to remember that at the end of the day, it really is celebrating the sacredness of life.
Totally agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Thanks for everyone who tuned in today.